At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was certain of one thing: politics belonged to men. Across the continent, this belief was treated not as an opinion, but as a fact of nature. Governments were built on it. Laws assumed it. Universities reinforced it. Even reformers who argued for broader democracy often stopped short of questioning who democracy was actually for. Women were present everywhere in society, but absent from power. They worked in factories, on farms, in homes and schools. They paid taxes. They followed laws. They endured the consequences of political decisions made entirely without them. And in almost every European country, this arrangement was defended as reasonable. Some argued women were too emotional. Others claimed they lacked education. Many insisted that public life would corrupt them. The language changed. The conclusion did not. Politics, Europe agreed, was not a place for women. This was not fringe thinking. It was mainstream. It was embedded in constitutions, parliaments, and courts. Even in countries that considered themselves modern and progressive, women's political rights were delayed, restricted, or dismissed altogether. At the turn of the century, no major European power allowed women to vote on equal terms with men. None allowed them to stand for parliament. None seriously considered handing them real political authority. Europe believed it understood democracy, and it believed women stood outside of it. Then, quietly and without fanfare, a small country on the northern edge of the continent changed the rules. In 1906, Finland did something no other European nation had done before. It granted women full political rights, not partial suffrage, not symbolic participation, not delayed promises tied to property, education, or marital status. Full rights. Women could vote. Women could stand for office. Women could sit in parliament and help govern the nation. And when elections were held the following year, women did not merely participate. They entered parliament in numbers that shocked observers across Europe. This was not a gradual experiment. It was a complete break. What makes this moment remarkable is not just that Finland acted first. It is how decisively it acted, and how little Europe seemed prepared to understand what had happened. Outside Finland, the reaction was not admiration. It was confusion, skepticism, in some cases open ridicule. The assumption remained that Finland was an exception, not an example, a curiosity shaped by unusual circumstances, not a model worth following. Europe dismissed what Finland had done, and in doing so, it revealed just how deeply its beliefs about power, gender, and democracy were rooted. To understand why Finland moved first, and why the rest of Europe hesitated for so long, we have to look beyond the reform itself. The decision did not emerge from a single law, a single leader, or a sudden burst of enlightenment. It was the result of long-term pressures, social realities, and political calculations that made Finland different in ways Europe underestimated. At the start of the 20th century, Finland was not an independent country. It existed as an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire, governed by its own laws and institutions, but ultimately subject to imperial authority. This position was precarious, but it also created space. Finnish society placed unusually strong emphasis on education and literacy. By European standards, literacy rates were high, including among women. Schools reached deep into rural areas. Newspapers circulated widely. Political ideas traveled quickly. Women were not hidden from public life. They worked, organized, taught, and participated in national movements long before they were formally invited into politics. At the same time, Finland was undergoing rapid social change. Industrialization was reshaping cities. Rural life was under pressure. Class tensions were growing. Political movements were mobilizing broad segments of the population. Crucially, these movements did not exclude women. Women were active in labor organizations, temperance movements, and nationalist causes. They were visible participants, not silent supporters. By the early 1900s, it was increasingly difficult to argue that women lacked political awareness or civic responsibility. Yet awareness alone did not grant power. The turning point came through crisis. As the Russian Empire tightened its grip on Finland in the early 1900s, attempting to limit autonomy and suppress local institutions, resistance grew. Political unity became a necessity rather than an ideal. The legitimacy of governance itself was under threat. In this environment, reform was not merely about justice, it was about survival. Finland needed a political system that could mobilize the widest possible support. Exclusion became a liability. Limiting participation weakened legitimacy at the exact moment legitimacy mattered most. Universal suffrage was no longer a radical dream. It became a practical solution. And when the decision was made, it was made fully. Finland did not test women's participation cautiously. It did not grant rights with caveats or conditions. It did not wait to see how society would react. It acted. This decisiveness is what stunned Europe. Many observers assumed the reform would fail, that women would not vote, that they would vote irresponsibly, that political order would suffer. None of that happened. Instead, the Finnish parliament that emerged in 1907 reflected a society that had expanded its idea of who belonged in democracy. Women entered politics not as symbols, but as legislators. They debated laws, shaped policy, and participated in the work of governance from the beginning. And still, Europe hesitated. Rather than reconsider its assumptions, many countries treated Finland as an anomaly. Too small, too remote, too unique to matter. What Europe failed to recognize was that Finland had exposed a flaw in its own understanding of democracy. The question was no longer whether women were capable of political participation. The question was why they had been excluded for so long. That question would linger across the continent for decades, and it would not be answered without resistance. Outside Finland, the reaction to the 1906 reform was cautious at best and dismissive at worst. European newspapers reported on the decision with curiosity, but rarely with urgency. Commentators described it as an experiment, a regional anomaly shaped by Finland's unusual position within the Russian Empire. Some framed it as a temporary concession made under pressure, not a genuine transformation of political life. Few treated it as a warning. In many countries, the response followed a familiar pattern. Finland was acknowledged, then explained away. Its small population, its peripheral location, its lack of imperial ambition were all cited as reasons why its choices did not apply elsewhere. The underlying assumption remained intact. What worked in Finland would not work in Europe's centers of power. This was not ignorance, it was confidence. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe still believed it sat at the pinnacle of political development. Parliaments in London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna saw themselves as the guardians of modern governance. Their systems were older, larger, and more complex than Finland's. If women had a place in politics, many believed, those systems would discover it in time, but not yet. The arguments against women's political participation were carefully constructed and endlessly repeated. Women, it was said, lacked the education required for serious decision-making. They were too closely tied to religion, tradition, or emotion. They would vote as their husbands or priests instructed them. Politics would become unstable, sentimental, irrational. Some opponents framed exclusion as protection. Politics, they argued, was a harsh and corrupting arena. Women were better suited to moral influence from outside the state, shaping society through family, education, and charity. Others were more blunt. Power, they believed, was not meant to be shared. What made Finland unsettling was that it disrupted these arguments without directly confronting them. There was no dramatic ideological manifesto aimed at Europe. No attempt to lecture other nations. Finland simply acted, and in doing so, it removed the safety of abstraction. The Finnish parliament, elected in 1907, included 19 women. This was not symbolic representation, it was substantive. Women participated across political parties, representing workers, rural communities, and urban voters alike. They did not behave as Europe expected. They did not vote as a bloc. They did not withdraw from debate. They did not destabilize governance. Instead, they engaged with the same issues that dominated Finnish politics at the time: education, labor conditions, public health, and national autonomy. They argued, negotiated, compromised. In other words, they governed. For European observers willing to look closely, this posed a problem. The predicted chaos failed to materialize. The justifications for exclusion began to look increasingly thin. Rather than confront this directly, many chose delay. Across Europe, suffrage movements existed long before Finland's reform. Women organized, protested, published, and petitioned governments. In Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere, the demand for political rights was persistent and increasingly visible. But progress remained slow. In some countries, limited concessions were offered. Municipal voting, school boards, local councils, rights tied to property ownership or education. These reforms were framed as steps forward, but they preserved the core exclusion. Women were allowed near power, but not into it. Finland's example hovered in the background of these debates, sometimes cited by reformers, often dismissed by opponents. It became a reference point that could not be ignored entirely, yet rarely embraced. What Europe struggled to admit was that the barrier was not readiness, but reluctance. Granting women political rights required rethinking the foundations of authority. It meant acknowledging that long-standing assumptions about competence, responsibility, and citizenship were flawed. It threatened hierarchies that extended beyond gender into class, tradition, and control. Finland had crossed that threshold under pressure. Europe, more secure in its institutions, felt no such urgency. Ironically, this confidence would prove misplaced. The years that followed would expose the fragility of Europe's political systems in ways few had anticipated. War, revolution, and economic collapse would reshape the continent far more violently than suffrage reform ever could. But before those shocks arrived, resistance to women's political participation remained strong. In Britain, suffrage activists faced imprisonment, force-feeding, and public hostility. In France, the idea of women voting was repeatedly rejected well into the 20th century. In Germany, reform came only after imperial collapse and war. Again and again, Europe waited for crisis to justify change. Finland's experience suggested another path. Reform undertaken deliberately, before catastrophe, could strengthen legitimacy rather than undermine it. This lesson went largely unheeded. Within Finland, the consequences of the 1906 reform continued to unfold. Women's participation did not solve every political problem. Class tensions remained. National autonomy was still contested. Social divisions would eventually erupt into violence. But the presence of women in political life altered the culture of governance in subtle ways. Debate widened. Issues of welfare, education, and social policy gained greater prominence. Political participation became less abstract, more closely tied to everyday life. Most importantly, democracy became habitual. Citizenship was no longer defined narrowly. It was practiced broadly. This distinction mattered. When Finland later faced internal conflict and external threat, its political institutions, though strained, rested on a wider base of participation than many European states could claim. The reform of 1906 did not prevent crisis, but it shaped how crisis was confronted. Europe, watching from a distance, continued to hesitate. The continent would not fully confront the question Finland had already answered until the devastation of the First World War forced political systems to adapt. By then, the cost of delay was measured in millions of lives. Finland's decision had not been radical in intent. It was pragmatic, strategic, and grounded in the realities of its society. Europe dismissed it as premature. History would suggest the opposite. When Europe finally changed its mind, it did not do so calmly. The shift did not come from persuasion, debate, or gradual acceptance. It came through collapse. The First World War shattered assumptions that had governed European politics for generations. Empires fell, monarchies collapsed, millions died. The political systems that had confidently excluded women proved incapable of preventing catastrophe. In the aftermath, the question of who deserved a voice could no longer be postponed. Women had worked in factories, hospitals, farms, and offices, while men fought at the front. They had maintained economies and communities under extreme strain. The argument that they lacked civic responsibility had become impossible to sustain. Across Europe, suffrage reforms followed, not because leaders had been convinced, but because legitimacy had been broken. In Britain, women over 30 gained the right to vote in 1918, followed by full equality a decade later. In Germany, women's suffrage arrived with the collapse of the empire and the birth of the Weimar Republic. In many countries, political rights were extended amid revolution, defeat, and fear of further unrest. Democracy expanded, but under pressure. This contrast mattered. Finland's reform had come before catastrophe. Europe's reforms followed it. That difference shaped how political participation was understood. In many European states, women's suffrage was framed as compensation for sacrifice, a reward earned through suffering. In Finland, it had been framed as a structural necessity, a way to strengthen governance before it failed. The result was subtle but lasting. In Finland, women entered politics without being cast as symbols of recovery or national redemption. They were legislators from the beginning, integrated into a system that expected their participation rather than reacting to it. This early normalization mattered during moments of strain. When Finland descended into civil war in 1918, political institutions were tested brutally. The presence of women in parliament did not prevent violence, but it shaped how political life resumed afterward. Democratic participation was not reset, it was resumed. The inclusion that began in 1906 did not disappear when crisis arrived. In the years that followed, Finnish political culture evolved cautiously. Compromise, coalition building, and incremental reform became central features of governance. These tendencies were influenced by many factors, including trauma and restraint, but broad participation played a role. Democracy had been practiced widely for more than a decade before it was nearly lost. That experience mattered. Elsewhere in Europe, newly expanded suffrage arrived alongside instability. Political systems were fragile, untested, and contested. Participation widened rapidly, but without the same foundation of habit. In some countries, democracy struggled to survive. This was not a failure of women's participation, it was a failure of systems that had delayed reform until legitimacy collapsed. Finland's experience suggested that inclusion was not a destabilizing force, but a stabilizing one when introduced deliberately and early. This lesson was rarely acknowledged explicitly, but it shaped outcomes. By the interwar years, Finland had one of the most established traditions of women's political participation in Europe. Women served in parliament consistently, across parties and regions. Their presence was no longer remarkable, it was expected. This normality distinguished Finland from many countries where women's political roles remained contested or symbolic. The significance of this difference became clearer over time. As Europe lurched toward extremism in the 1920s and 1930s, political polarization intensified. Democratic norms eroded in several states. Participation alone could not save democracy, but exclusion had clearly weakened it. Finland, shaped by early inclusion and later restraint, resisted these pressures more successfully than many expected. This resistance was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made earlier, under very different circumstances. The 1906 reform did not guarantee Finland's democratic survival, but it contributed to a political culture less dependent on rigid hierarchies and more accustomed to shared responsibility. This mattered when decisions became difficult. It mattered when compromise was unpopular. It mattered when restraint was tested. And it mattered when the temptation to narrow democracy reappeared. Europe's delay in recognizing the value of inclusion carried long-term consequences. In some countries, women's political rights were granted, then undermined. In others, they arrived alongside authoritarian movements that hollowed out democratic institutions entirely. Finland's path was not smooth, but it was continuous. Women were present at the table before democracy was forced to defend itself. That presence became part of what democracy meant. This continuity shaped memory. In Finland, women's suffrage is remembered not as a concession wrested from reluctant elites, but as a foundational decision. It is woven into the story of national development rather than appended to it. In much of Europe, the story is more fractured. Suffrage arrives amid turmoil, its meaning shaped by conflict rather than foresight. This difference reflects the core argument of Finland's example. Change made early, deliberately, and inclusively strengthens institutions. Change delayed until crisis weakens them. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe believed women's participation was a risk to democracy. Finland treated exclusion as the greater risk. History would suggest Finland made the safer choice. Over time, Finland's early decisions stopped being remarkable and started becoming invisible. That invisibility was not a failure of memory. It was a sign of success. When women's participation in politics becomes routine, it no longer needs to be defended. It becomes part of the background of governance, shaping decisions quietly rather than dramatically. In Finland, this normalization happened earlier than almost anywhere else in Europe. By the 1920s, women were no longer newcomers to parliament. They were experienced legislators, committee members, and party figures. Their presence was not tied to novelty or symbolism. It was tied to work. This mattered most in areas of policy that rarely dominate headlines but define daily life. Education reform, public health, social welfare, labor protections, and family policy all benefited from broader representation. These issues were not treated as secondary concerns. They were integrated into the political agenda as core responsibilities of the state. This integration altered how power functioned. Decision-making became less abstract, more grounded in lived experience. Politics did not become gentler or conflict-free, but it became harder to detach from consequences. Legislation increasingly reflected the realities of households, communities, and workplaces, rather than purely ideological visions. Finland's political culture evolved accordingly. Debate remained sharp, sometimes bitter. Parties clashed over class, ideology, and national direction. The presence of women did not erase these divisions. What it did was widen the frame within which disagreements unfolded. Politics became less insular. This broader base of participation proved valuable during moments of stress. After the Civil War, Finland faced the task of rebuilding trust in institutions that had nearly collapsed. The legitimacy of governance could not be restored by force alone. It required visible inclusion, shared responsibility, and gradual reform. Women's continued participation in Parliament reinforced the idea that democracy belonged to the entire population, not just those who had prevailed militarily or politically. This was not reconciliation in the emotional sense, but it was stabilization. The habit of inclusion helped anchor political life during a period when resentment and trauma might otherwise have hollowed it out. As Finland moved through the interwar years, this habit persisted. While extremist movements gained traction elsewhere in Europe, Finland's political system remained cautious. It absorbed pressure rather than amplifying it. Coalition governments, incremental reform, and legal restraint became defining features of governance. These tendencies were shaped by many factors, including the memory of internal violence. But early democratic inclusion contributed to the system's resilience. Democracy was not treated as a reward for stability. It was treated as a prerequisite for it. This distinction became increasingly important as Europe drifted toward another catastrophe. The rise of authoritarian regimes in the 1930s exposed the fragility of political systems that relied on exclusion and hierarchy. In many countries, democratic institutions lacked the deep-rooted legitimacy needed to withstand pressure. Finland faced its own challenges during this period, including external threats and internal tension. But its political culture, shaped by early reform and broad participation, proved adaptable. When war arrived again, Finland mobilized under extreme conditions without abandoning its democratic framework entirely. Political life narrowed, but it did not collapse. Women remained present in public decision-making, even as the nation focused on survival. After the Second World War, Europe finally caught up with what Finland had begun decades earlier. Women's political rights became standard across the continent. Participation expanded. Representation increased. What had once been treated as radical became routine. But the timing mattered. In countries where inclusion arrived late, democratic habits were still forming as institutions faced Cold War pressures, ideological division, and economic upheaval. The learning curve was steep. Finland, by contrast, entered the post-war era with decades of experience in inclusive governance. Its democracy had been tested, strained, and repaired without fully excluding half the population. This experience influenced how Finland approached the future. Political power was treated cautiously. Authority was constrained. Broad participation was assumed rather than debated. These were not abstract commitments. They were lessons learned. Over time, Finland's early reforms ceased to be a point of comparison and became a foundation. Younger generations grew up taking women's political participation for granted. The idea that women had once been excluded seemed distant, even strange. This was the ultimate mark of structural change. What had once challenged Europe's assumptions now required explanation itself. Why had exclusion lasted so long elsewhere? Why had competence been doubted when evidence contradicted it? Why had democracy been defined so narrowly for so many years? These questions were easier to ask in hindsight than they had been to answer in advance. Finland's example did not offer moral superiority, it offered perspective. It showed that political systems are shaped less by inevitability than by choices. That reforms delayed are often defended as prudent, but turn out to be costly. That inclusion strengthens legitimacy before it is desperately needed. Europe eventually learned this lesson. Finland learned it earlier, and in doing so, it quietly reshaped what democracy could look like. By the time Europe fully accepted women as political equals, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had fallen, borders had shifted, entire political systems had collapsed and been rebuilt under pressure. The cost of delay was no longer theoretical. It was written into the history of the 20th century. Finland's decision in 1906 did not prevent war. It did not guarantee stability. It did not shield the country from violence or loss. What it did was quieter. It expanded the idea of who belonged in democracy before democracy was forced to defend itself. That expansion mattered more than Finland could have known at the time. When inclusion arrives early, it becomes habit. When it arrives late, it feels like concession. This difference shapes how political systems respond to stress, disagreement, and fear. Finland learned this through experience rather than ideology. The reform was not framed as a victory for women alone. It was framed as a necessary adjustment to reality. Women were already working, organizing, educating, and sustaining society. Excluding them from political power had become illogical. That clarity was rare in Europe at the time. Elsewhere, arguments about readiness, tradition, and stability dominated political debate. Change was postponed in the name of caution. Democracy was treated as something fragile, to be expanded only when conditions were perfect. Those conditions never arrived. Instead, Europe learned that exclusion weakens institutions long before inclusion ever could. Finland's early reform revealed a different truth. That legitimacy grows stronger when more people are invested in it. That shared responsibility creates resilience. That democracy is not diluted by participation, but anchored by it. These lessons were not proclaimed loudly. They were absorbed gradually, reinforced by practice. Over decades, Finland's political culture internalized the assumption that participation was normal, not exceptional. Power was distributed, not concentrated. Authority was constrained, not elevated. These instincts would define how Finland navigated future crises. When pressure mounted from abroad, restraint prevailed at home. When fear threatened to narrow democracy, memory pushed back. When temptation arose to simplify governance by excluding voices, history offered a warning. The decision made in 1906 became part of that memory. It was not remembered as a moment of moral triumph. It was remembered as a practical choice that worked. Europe eventually reached the same conclusion. By the mid-20th century, women's political participation was no longer controversial across most of the continent. What had once been dismissed as premature became unremarkable. But the order of events mattered. Finland did not follow collapse with reform. It followed reform with survival. That sequence shaped everything that came after. Today, Finland's early adoption of women's political rights is often cited as evidence of progressiveness or foresight. Those labels are not wrong, but they are incomplete. The deeper significance lies in what the reform reveals about how societies change. It shows that democracy is not strengthened by waiting for consensus. It is strengthened by widening it. That inclusion does not require perfection. It requires recognition. Europe dismissed women for generations not because evidence was lacking, but because assumptions were comfortable. Finland challenged those assumptions not through rhetoric, but through action. And when the results contradicted fear, the silence that followed spoke louder than any argument. In the end, this story is not only about women, it is about misjudgment, about the cost of underestimating people, about the danger of mistaking tradition for stability, about the quiet strength of systems that trust more voices, not fewer. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe believed women did not belong in politics. Finland proved otherwise, and in doing so, it changed the rules not just for itself, but for everyone who would eventually follow.